available, I think as early as February 10th, to accept submissions for credentials who wish to be considered for inclusion on the master credentials list. And that's really the purpose of today's webinar, to kind of talk through that application and provide some context here. So what you're going to get over the next 40 minutes or so at this point, kind of an explanation of the application process, provide some more information around what type of information the application is requesting and why that is important for us. Overall, I think the important context to have in mind is the application is designed to really do two things. One is collect the enough and the right amount of information to properly evaluate a credential for its inclusion on the master credentials list. That is, does it meet the definition of credentials of value established by the committee? And then secondary in the application is for those credentials that are seeking CAPE funding eligibility, there's another set of information that needs to be collected so that the Department of Education can appropriately make those determinations for funding eligibility. So as you're going through today and hearing from our team, I want you to keep those two things in mind, right? That the application is kind of serving a twofold purpose. But also one element is inclusion on the master credentials list, and another element is CAPE funding eligibility, and those are separate things, right? One criteria for CAPE funding eligibility is being on the master credentials list, but there are a host of other criteria for that eligibility as well. So just keep that in mind as you listen today. But excited that you are here. The other thing that's important in this process is the reason we have an application is the Credentials Review Committee will review on a quarterly basis, right, new submissions and additions to that master credentials list throughout the year. Once a year, when new labor market information is available, credentials will be reevaluated for demand and for wages against new criteria, right, or new labor market information. So that will happen once a year. But credentials will be added 4 times a year, right, quarterly, and then 1 time per year be evaluated for those that might have to be removed because they no longer meet the demand and wage criteria. So just give you kind of an idea. But again, the purpose of today is to go through the application. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Adam Briggs, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want, before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I want to acknowledge the interpartner team that is conducting much of this work. Several of them are on this call to help facilitate the discussion that you see here, the team from CareerSource Florida, and we're also joined by our colleagues from the Division of Career, Technical and Adult Education at the Florida Department of Education, Vice Chancellor Tara Goodman and Caitlin Vickers. Before we jump into the substance of the presentation, I just want to orient you a bit to where much of the information that we're going to discuss today can be found. Can everyone see the screen, Florida Credentials Review Committee? If you go to the boardroom section of our website and to the Credentials Review Committee under that drop down, it'll take you to the page you see here. Then if you click on Master Credentials List from that menu, you will then see prior master credentials lists at the top of the page, and in the center, the items of a special interest for those on this call, the application and supporting materials. So to start with, I want to highlight the framework of quality because much of this work that Dan was describing begins and ends with the framework of quality that was adopted by the Credentials Review Committee in December of last year, and against which the credentials that are currently the first on the state's master credentials list for 23-24 were judged in terms of meeting demand factors, wage factors, and if relevant, sequencing factors. So I want to draw your attention to the framework of quality for those who may not be familiar with it. This is sort of a digest of the main points that we will be emphasizing at different stages of this presentation today from different perspectives, sometimes from the local demand side, sometimes from the sequencing side, and so on. Next, you have a document, a series of documents that we'll be walking through step by step during this presentation. I wanted to draw your attention, just by way of mention, to the frequently asked questions that we have compiled and have been up on the website for a couple of weeks now. We look forward to expanding this list as we respond to inquiries from interested stakeholders, and thereby increasing the body of knowledge that we have and that we're able to share on this new process. So I'll pass it back to Jackie if she will bring the slide deck back up for everyone, please. All right, next slide, please. So as Dan mentioned, all this work is grounded in the REACH Act of 2021 and its requirement that we develop a master credentials list that is that demonstrates, indicates credentials of value against a framework of quality that's been adopted. Next slide, please. So credentials that are currently eligible to apply are both degree and non-degree credentials that are listed here. Apart from the two at the bottom, those being the two associate's degree level credentials that are designated in the law, you also have above those a grouping of non-degree credentials, including industry certifications, apprenticeships, and so on. Next slide, please. So this is a website address that I was referring to earlier. If you go to careersourceflorida.com/master credentials list, you'll see the resources that I was referring to earlier. So this application platform is open year-round, and submissions will be reviewed 4 times a year in advance of the Credentials Review Committee meeting, at which the credentials that are recommended for inclusion will be considered. And so there will be a cutoff in advance of that meeting in order to allow the interpartner team adequate time to conduct a thorough and careful review of the credentials that have been submitted to the online application platform. And for the upcoming meeting in May of the CRC, the cutoff for the application is March the 15th. In addition to the 2 items that I referred to earlier, the framework of quality and the frequently asked questions, you can also see on the webpage, and I'll turn to that now, the Getting Started with the Master Credentials List application. So I will share that with you and walk through some of the highlights of that document. So as we've been discussing so far, the objective of all this work in response to the law is to align the credentials that are available in the state's workforce education system with jobs that promote economic self-sufficiency. And also, we are seeking to provide a public and transparent inventory of credentials that have been approved by the state as being credentials of value. You see here at the bottom of this page the graphic for the simplified evaluation flow for degree credentials. And in this case, as you may recall from the prior slide, we're speaking here of the 2 associate's degree types that are at the bottom. Degree programs per the law need only to meet demand factors. So if a credential meets state or regional demand as defined in the framework of quality that we were discussing earlier, then it is eligible for inclusion on the master credentials list. If a degree credential, associate degree credential, does not meet state regional demand, then it has an opportunity to demonstrate that it responds to local demand. And my colleague Daryl McCall from the CareerSource Florida professional team will walk through the local demand process in some detail in just a moment. Similarly, on the non-degree credential side, that being the bulk of the credentials that were currently eligible to apply, as you saw in the prior slide, those must meet demand factors and wage factors. And so, as in the prior graphic, they first are tested against state regional demand. If they don't meet state or regional demand, they need to meet local demand in order to pass on to the wage criteria or the wage factor. If they meet the wage factor, that is to say the SOC code that is associated with the non-degree credential, connects to an occupation that has wages that reach the mid to high level wage as defined in the framework, then that credential, having satisfied demand and wages, is eligible to include on the master credentials list. If the credential has met demand but has wages that fall below the wage threshold, then the credential is able to assert that it sequences to a higher level credential whose wages through the SOC association do meet the wage threshold, subject to some criteria that I'll be covering later in the discussion. But the basic criterion there that is to be kept in mind is that in order to be eligible for a career sequencing argument, the credential's own associated wages must be at or above the high school only measure, according to the Florida Department of Education's FETPIP system, which is an index of high school only with no additional credentials or no additional completed education. The premise being that a credential, in order to demonstrate that it is a credential of value, should have earnings that are above the high school only basement threshold. So we'll talk at some length about the SOC code connection and other SIP code factors and FDOE certification codes and so on in the context of the application. So I will stop sharing my screen now and turn back to Jackie to the slide deck, please. Next slide, please. Great. So for those who have already looked into the MCL online application, you will recognize here a number of the elements of information that are solicited from the applicant. Things like, what type of submitter are you? Are you a local workforce development board, or are you an education partner from a school district or an FCS institution? Tell us about the name and type of credential that you have. Is it a degree or a non-degree credential, etc. And to the extent that the credential already exists and has gone through Florida DOE evaluation as a registered apprenticeship or applied technical credential, then help us crosswalk the reference numbers from that that context with this application, so that again, over time, we can connect credentials to each other, to various existing administrative and academic and professional development frameworks. There's a question on, I'll pause here. There's a question. Are folks not seeing the screen, the slide deck? Feel free, whoever popped the question in the chat, to unmute and ask the question. I want to make sure everyone can see what they're supposed to see.
Yeah, no, I'm not able to see a slide deck at all. Is there a special setting I need to change?
Brad, do you have, excuse me, this is Jackie. Do you have one screen or two? I'm wondering if that could be the issue.
Well, I have one screen. I'll try to close other things. see.
So fortunately, we'll be able to share this slide deck out afterward, and as well, we'll have a recording. So if we need to follow up, if you're not able to resolve the technical issue, you'll have an opportunity to review this content. Someone in the chat says sometimes going out of Teams and coming back in may resolve the issue.
Okay, I'll try that. Thank you.
Excuse me. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Standard Occupational Classification Code, or SOC code, like the framework of quality itself, is a central element in this entire evaluation exercise. Because the SOC code allows us to make determinations about the demand, the connection between the credential and an occupation that is in demand at either the state and regional or local level, as well the wages that are associated with that demand. So several on the call now, turning to the second bullet, several on the call now may be may have credentials that are provisionally on the master credentials list that was published a couple of weeks ago. And there will be an indication for those that are on provisionally on the right-hand side in yellow that they need to either demonstrate local demand or credential sequencing or both. So we're going to have more on each of these topics in the remainder of this webinar, but I want to invite you to send an email, because the SOC code that was used to make the determination that the credential needed to provide additional information, since that determination is SOC specific, you'll need to know what that SOC is in order to proceed with providing that. The credentials that are on the list provisionally are there until the end of the last review cycle of the 2023 calendar year that leads into the first credentials review committee meeting in 2024, by which point the credentials on provisionally will need to have demonstrated provided additional information on either local demand or sequencing or both. If you'll send an email to the mcl@careersourceflorida.com web address, we'll be happy to provide you with the SOC code that was used in the initial analysis that resulted in the determination that additional information on demand or on sequencing was required, excuse me. And as we move through subsequent application and evaluation cycles, the interpartner review team will add additional informational fields to the MCL that is published online. So let me pause here for a second, and there are a couple of questions.
Sean, go ahead with your question.
Hello, how are you?
Hello.
Working from home due to the fun COVID thing. So, Dr. Briggs, I know you're very, very busy right now, obviously, just like the rest of us. I had sent you an email a couple weeks ago specific to a Lightcast report to cure the data scientist 15.2051 for those 7 certifications that did not meet local demand. Have you had a chance to review that yet? That report to see it? It basically, the wage is up around 65,000. For the Tallahassee region, it's far more than the 30 job openings that is required. Would something like that cure the local demand issue?
My apologies. My impression from that exchange, and I think it involved, Dan was involved in the discussion. Yes. I believe Daryl may also have been as well. My understanding was that the issue had been resolved. So my apology, because there were conversations taking place in that arena. I'm happy to follow up with you all, or for us to follow up with you on that specific question as to the relevance and appropriateness of the evidence that you suggested.
Okay, if you would just send me an email, that would be fantastic.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Other questions on this topic before we walk through the additional technical assistance documents on local demand and credential sequencing? Okay, let's turn, next slide, please, Jackie. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to my colleague, Daryl McCall, who will share on his screen the local demand document and walk through some highlights of that.
Adam, excuse me, before we move on, there's a question in the chat that is pertaining to the last slide. Amy Locklear is asking, do we provide information on the provisionally approved credentials via the regular application process, and is there a deadline?
Yes, there is a deadline. As I suggested earlier, the cutoff is September the 30th for the credentials that will be reviewed in advance of the first Credentials Review Committee meeting of the calendar year. So the meeting will notionally, Credentials Review Committee meeting will notionally take place in, say, February of 2024, and the credentials that are on the current master credentials list provisionally will need to have applied through the online application before the September 30th cutoff in order to have the information evaluated. You don't have to wait until then, but you also don't have to submit it by March 15th if you're provisionally on the list. So that's an outline of the time horizon. Does that help, Amy?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Daryl.
All right, thank you, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure, Daryl McCall, Senior Director here at CareerSource Florida, our Business and Workforce Strategies. I have the pleasure of introducing the local demand piece of this framework of quality, and I specifically want to go over this one-pager document that Adam referred to and just walk high level through some of the opportunities here. So as Adam alluded to, both educational entities as well as our workforce boards can submit credentials. And however, if those do not meet that statewide demand, that regional demand threshold as laid out by the Labor Market Estimating Conference, there is a door to come through, and that is local demand. Not all jobs are statewide or regional. Mariana is very different from Miami, as you all know. And really, ultimate goal of this is really to point people to training programs that end up in credentials that end up into higher wage occupations that people can go right into work. So I've had the pleasure of working with our partners to really look at local demand and lay out a good framework. The one piece of the local framework that I think is very important is not like CAPE, it's still a three-legged stool, right? We need workforce development, economic development, and education to all be on the same page. And that's step one, really getting that support for the submitting of a credential from all three partners. But because it is a workforce component, your local workforce boards are the only entities that will be able to submit for local demand. So while you, like Sean, our good friend Sean Friend, might be able to pull data together, pull proof. I know a lot of you do industry advisory committees and councils for your framework curriculums and for your local programs. You know, pulling that industry data and helping for the submission to go through that local workforce board, that's key. The second component of this is really that direct linkage to the SOC code, right? So we know not all linkages are the same. Some are long shots. You know, we're connected in this long way. Some are very straightforward. A registered nurse is directly linked to a SOC code of a registered nurse. So some are very clear, but that has to be a direct link. And so we lay out the SOC association link there for you to look at it as well. Evidence is a key component of that. Sean Friend mentioned this. And in the criteria, this needs to be proof, right? Proof of actual job openings, proof of actual employers who will hire someone based on this credential, this certification, this registered apprenticeship, this degree. So that's really where a lot of the meat is, right? Is there really an employer with a real job that will hire someone based on this? And so the framework lays out the requirement of evidence that can be shown, right? So from the local area. And I skipped over one, I apologize. Sorry, step 3 is really the linkage to a occupation and an industry sector of focus. That is a area that is in demand in the area that your area is focusing on. We've listed some examples here. These are examples of industries of focus as established by Enterprise Florida. But in each area, you'll have not only industry sectors that you're focusing on, but also emerging industry areas. So things like economic development projects, folks that are bringing in new jobs or new opportunities. The proof piece is the job opening piece, and that is tied basically to either the local threshold as set by that local workforce development board, or if there's not a threshold, we've come up with a 30 minimum opening. Now, most of our boards have a threshold, and I think the few that have not yet established one will probably work with you all in concert and establish a threshold. And then the fifth and final piece is whether or not the wages associated with a credential meet or exceed that wage threshold that Adam alluded to. So those are really the 5 components. This one pager kind of dives in a little deeper. I encourage you to kind of go and look and review this, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. All right, I don't see any. I'll turn it back over to you guys. Oh, there's the one couple. Okay, I guess we'll start. Am I doing this? Amy, I guess we'll start with you. I see you right here. Thank you.
Thank you. I wondered if, I'm from Daytona State College, wondering if you could speak a little bit about the industry sectors of focus and how we identify those. I mean, is there a list for each region, or do we contact our local board?
That's a great question. So yeah, that is it's usually defined at the local board area in concert with economic development and hopefully education too, right? We're trying to pull everyone together, right? We're all in agreement that we need manufacturers in Volusia County. So we were all going to say, you know what, this is an industry we want to focus on in our area. We got plenty of hospitality. We're not going to really focus on hospitality. We're going to focus on manufacturing. So that's a great question.
Thank you. So it's
Absolutely.
really a matter of written support from the local board and economic development organizations and so forth.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And then I see
Amy McAllister.
Yeah, McAllister. Yeah.
Thank you. I also had a question about that emerging occupations list, because we have a lot of demand in some industries that aren't listed in there, like construction, agriculture,
Sure.
and hospitality and tourism.
Yeah.
So how do we work with that when those sectors aren't engaged as emerging, but yet we have a high local demand?
And I think that goes back to that conversation, right? So there's a lot of demand for retail salespersons, but is that the focus of the area, right?
And to the extent that you can get consensus from the education partner, the economic development partner, and the workforce development board, and that 3-legged stool that Daryl was referring to, the documentation of that through the letters of support would demonstrate that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback real quick, the emerging piece, I mean, that is a perfect example of businesses that are relocating or expanding in your area that are maybe already working with your local economic development partners. Those again will support they could be targeted as well. Those are just, in other words, those are just examples. That's not the master list. It really depends on your area.
All right, Daryl, in the interest of time, so that we can get through the remainder of this, this is largely intended to be an overview, and I suspect it'll be a prelude to future inquiries and conversations. So again, if you have questions that we're not able to address today, please feel free to reach out to mcl@careersourceflorida.com, and my colleague Warren Davis curates that webpage, and we'll do our very best to be responsive to your questions. I'm going to turn now to the credential sequencing technical assistance document that you can find on the webpage that we were referring to earlier. And again, the credential sequencing for those who are on provisionally is based on a SOC association that resulted in the determination that the wages associated through the SOC with that credential were not at the wage threshold level prescribed by the framework of quality. And so the law for non-degree credentials, these being the only ones that are subject to the wage factor, the law provides a mechanism by which a credential can assert that it is part of a sequence that leads to the next level occupation that does meet the wage threshold. And so this technical assistance document that you see here on the screen lays out the criteria for that and walks you through the basic mechanics of what that evaluation process would look like. So I'm going to stop sharing this. Again, if you have a question on this credential sequencing topic, please feel free to send a message to mcl@careersourceflorida.com and put credential sequencing in the subject line. That way we can track these submissions over time. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Warren Davis, to walk us through some highlights of the interface between and the differences between the master credentials list process and the CAPE process, the historical CAPE process.
Thank you, Adam and Daryl. Hopefully everyone can now see the one pager that I have open on my screen on the master credentials list and CAPE. There's elements of this one pager that touch on the dynamics of the framework of quality that Adam and Daryl just referred to. I know everyone has a lot of questions about the Career and Professional Education Act, so I'll just kind of dive in and hopefully answer those questions now. And if not, again, you're certainly welcome to send feedback or questions to the email address that Adam provided earlier. So as previously indicated, Florida's Master Credentials List is a comprehensive list of state-approved degree and non-degree credentials of value. This, of course, includes CAPE secondary and post-secondary applications. CAPE industry certifications are defined as a voluntary process through which students are assessed by an independent third-party certifying entity using predetermined standards for knowledge, skills, and competencies resulting in the award of a credential. These certifications either do not have a statewide articulation agreement for college credit, or they have a statewide articulation agreement for no more than 14 college credits in a related post-secondary associate degree program. Secondary and post-secondary industry certifications seeking eligibility for Career and Professional Education Act funding must submit a master credentials list application. So back on the home screen that Adam showed earlier, where you go to apply for the master credentials list, you'll apply through that master credentials list application, and at some point there will be questions about that are specific to CAPE. You'll select that you're applying for CAPE, and then it'll take you on another route where you answer all the requisite questions related to the credential and its eligibility for CAPE. Submissions for CAPE must meet both the CAPE eligibility criteria as set forth in Rule 6A0576, Florida Administrative Code and Florida Administrative Register, and the standards defined in the framework of quality. So to that end, and to pick up a little bit on what Daryl was saying, this is completely envisioned as a collaboration between local workforce development boards, education partners, and economic development. So it's recommended that those who are submitting CAPE applications make sure that they understand both the framework of quality and the rules surrounding CAPE and what the requirements are going to be prior to submitting in the application portal. Florida's local workforce development boards, school districts, and institutions within the Florida college system may submit CAPE credentials to be included on the master credentials list. Those submitting industry certifications seeking CAPE Act funding will be reviewed annually. Submitters may submit credentials for consideration in the application portal or online application year-round. Submitters from the Florida college system, local workforce development boards, and school districts submitting credentials for consideration will be asked specific information about credentials, including the submitter, the certifying agency, the Standard Occupation Code Association, industry of focus, statewide and local demand for job seekers with these credentials, and finally, information will be required about the testing and proctoring process for obtaining the credential or certification. To be considered for addition to the master credentials list, credentials must be listed or linked to a SOC code, as Adam described earlier. Submitters are required to provide the SOC code to which the credential in question is linked. Validating the legitimacy of the asserted SOC linkage is an early step in the application review process. That's actually part of the MCL process. And then, like I said, you'll go on to answer more questions about CAPE. Current standard occupation codes are on the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics website. There's a link to that in the application itself, I believe. Credentials submitted for consideration should lead to an occupation in an emerging industry or in an industry sector of focus, as Daryl identified earlier. Those lists are also in the application themselves. They're also, I think, in the one-pagers and the framework of quality information that Adam provided earlier. Prior to submitting credentials for consideration, submitters will be asked to describe how the credential is linked to the chosen occupation and industry, which specific skills are acquired by obtaining the credential, and whether the credential is needed for that occupation. CAPE credentials must be linked to a standard occupation code that meets state, regional, or regional demand based on that occupation being included on one of the lists referred to in the demand section of the framework of quality. CAPE credentials must be linked to at least one standard occupation classification code that is either designated by the Labor Market Estimating Conference as an occupation in critical undersupply or included on the Florida Department of Economic Opportunities regional demand lists. Again, those were referenced by Adam and Daryl earlier. Only local workforce development boards may submit CAPE secondary or post-secondary certifications for consideration based on meeting the local demand criteria within the framework of quality. So education or local boards may submit if the SOC is on the statewide list, but if you're trying to prove local demand in a specific area, the local workforce development board are the ones that need to verify all of the information and submit that through the application portal. Non-degree credentials, including CAPE industry certifications that do not meet the wage criteria within the framework of quality, must be part of a sequence of credentials, as Adam indicated earlier. New industry certifications that meet the first two sequencing criteria in the framework by showing, one, that they have wages above the high school only basement wage threshold, and two, that they are validated and recognized by industry, may be recommended for conditional approval pending review of evidence of a career pathway through articulation or other means where documentation is available. Conditionally approved certifications must be reviewed for sequencing criteria within the first year of being added to the master credentials list. Those submitting credentials will be asked if the credential sequences to a higher level credential that meets the wage criteria. If the credential sequences to a higher level credential, submitters are required to provide credential information relevant FDOE codes where available for the higher level credentials. For additional information on this topic, please see the technical assistance documents on credential sequencing. Certifications that meet the CAPE criteria and are added to the 2023-2024 Master Credentials list will also be added to the 2023-2024 CAPE funding list. The deadline for CAPE funding submissions for the 2024-2025 school year is September 30th, 2023. And please note that certifications must be available at the time of application, and the information that's required in the application must be available at the time that the application is submitted. Now, I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but the way the application works is it does allow users to go through and save their information. There's a save button at the bottom of the application. So if someone's submitting information, I know how this works a little bit. CTE directors or local boards go through and they collect all the data for all the certifications that they're going to submit. And maybe that's 20 or 30 certifications, less or more. And there's 1 or 2 certifications where you don't have some of the information. In an effort to make it easier on everyone, we've made it possible so that you can save your information where you are and go back into that particular application once you've obtained the specific information, and then complete the answers and continue through to where you can save and submit the application. We hope that makes it easier for submissions to be submitted to us. And of course, at the end of your submission, you should get a notification that your credential or your application was received, and we will respond and follow up as necessary afterwards. As Adam indicated, if you have questions prior to submitting a CAPE application, feel free to contact us at mcl@careersourceflorida.com, and we'll respond as best we can or respond through our colleagues. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks so much, Warren. Jackie, if you can pull the final slide up with the final slide or two with the next steps to kind of give an overview of the review process for the credentials that are submitted. We've been quite efficient in this. It seems we're only about 2 minutes over time. So I want to be respectful of your time and give anyone an opportunity. There've been some great questions that have been posed in the chat for which responses have been provided to the extent that that was possible. Again, you have an open invitation. If you have a question on the MCL and CAPE, to put CAPE in your subject heading for the email. If you have a question for those provisionally on the website, on the MCL about the SOC association that was made to make that provisional determination, put SOC in the subject line. If you have a sequencing question, do likewise. These instructions being contained within each of the technical assistance documents. As Jackie indicated in response to the requests in the chat earlier, we'll also be sending these meeting materials out to everybody on the call for your benefit. We've covered an awful lot of content here, and we want to give you an opportunity to digest that, to offer follow-up questions, and to have these resources at hand as you do that. Any final questions before we sign off and look ahead to the next steps of this work?
So Adam, Tara with the Department of Education had her hand up. I don't know if, Tara, do you still have a question or a
I'm
comment?
sorry, I didn't see that.
Can you hear me?
There
Yes.
you are. We hear you. Uh-oh, I think we may have lost you
We
again.
can't hear
Tara.
you again, Tara.
Can you hear us? This is
Yes.
Caitlin.
Yes.
But it's not picking the phone now. My mic is
We can hear you, Tara.
It's fine.
Yeah,
Looks
because
like it
when I
might be
called
coming in and out.
like, I don't know if it's just automatically muted it or what.
No, we can hear you, Caitlin.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sounds like they can't hear us.
Ah,
All right, everyone, we will look forward to your inquiries to the email and to the
Well, I
continuation.
wasn't sure. This is Tara. I
We
wanted
can hear you.
to answer one of the questions that was in the chat, and hopefully some of you can hear me.
We can.
Some of the questions in the chat seem to indicate that people think that things that are on the 23-24 master credential list could fall off by August and not be available for CAPE for 23-24. I want to say that that is not accurate. If you are on the 23-24 list, those credentials are eligible for CAPE for 23-24. I don't want people to be concerned about the August deadline, an August deadline for remediating anything related to stackability or local demand for purposes of 23-24. Adam mentioned the September 30th deadline to get that information in so that we could deal with eligibility for 24-25. So I just wanted to make that case and make sure people understood that based on the question I saw in the chat.
All right, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to receiving your applications and your questions. I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you for your time.